Is Godzilla Minus One the best Godzilla film of all time? This is Exasperated Nerd Explains. I am a fan of Godzilla. I have seen all the films, read about his encounters with the Titanic and Charles Barkley. Yes, those are official comics. So I am familiar with the franchise. They generally come in two flavors. One is a classic conflict in literature, man versus Godzilla, where Godzilla is a terrible monster, a force of nature, a metaphor for war and destruction, where mankind must come together to defeat this unfathomable power. This is usually in the first few films of a rebooted series, including the original. Then there usually comes a turn, where instead of man versus Godzilla, it is monster versus Godzilla, another classic conflict, and in these, the big G usually becomes at worst neutral, but in some cases a force for good, protecting Japan from other monsters.
We're more like treasure protectors.
This is a majority of the rubber suit era, which can be goofy, but is also rightfully beloved. Godzilla Minus One is definitely in the former category of the two, where Godzilla is an unknown, a threat that the people must unite to stop. Another key in the formula of all Godzilla films is how it is divided in focus on people and the monster. This can vary greatly, some leaning heavily towards the people talkie, and others that lean heavier on the monster action with destruction and explosions. This film had a nice balance between the two, which worked perfectly for the story, partially because both types of scenes were well executed. Human drama. The human protagonist in Minus One is probably the most well-developed and memorable protagonist of any Godzilla film. It has very compelling human drama to the point that it would make an interesting movie even without Godzilla. I mean, there'd be a giant lizard-sized hole that would need to be filled with something, but the general plot of the cowardly kamikaze pilot helping a woman and child out in the aftermath of the war while he is unable to move on due to survivor's guilt and the shame of his cowardice is interesting and compelling. Instead of just being a metaphor for war, Godzilla is a fragment of his PTSD, which haunts him every night. And spoilers here up until the time code on the screen, up until the point where I saw the German written in the aircraft indicating there was an ejector seat, I genuinely was not certain if he would survive or not. At that point, I still did think Noriko, his love interest / house guest, was certainly dead because it seemed no one could survive what happened, and though it would leave their daughter an orphan, well, Japan especially values sacrifice, honor, those things, and I could see him deciding to sacrifice himself, thinking it's the only way not just to atone for his prior cowardice, but to save Akiko and others. I did think maybe the mechanic was going to trick him into surviving, and that the big red bomb safety lever was the ejection seat, but it does make more sense thematically that it was his choice to use the ejector seat and survive. I just assumed that because they pulled a sneaky by cutting that from the scene at the time and then flashing back to it as a reveal when he was told about it. The supporting characters are also all distinct with their own personalities and get a chance to shine in at least one point in the film. Some Godzilla films will relegate the people to essentially just explain what's going on, since Godzilla isn't exactly narrating, and are nothing more than that. Competent people. Another thing I appreciate was that it featured competent people doing competent things and coming up with ideas to solve the issue. They try conventional weapons while Godzilla is still in the water, but that does not work, and then they don't actively try doing it again other than a few tanks when Godzilla waddles up onto land. A lot of the older movies just have barrage after barrage of rockets or tank fire striking Godzilla and doing nothing. It can be fun to a degree, but it also feels like filler to make a longer action scene without adding anything dynamic. And this is usually in a world where Godzilla is a known thing and always shows up, but they keep shooting it for no reason. It's like when Superman shows up and they always shoot him. Guys, didn't you see this didn't work before? Maybe don't bother. So anyways, in this film, conventional weapons don't work, so they come up with a plan that is interesting, theoretical, and risky, ratcheting up the tension, but also displaying ingenuity and creativity by the people facing the threat, which you don't always see in movies. Godzilla. This film succeeds in making Godzilla seem like a genuine threat. Not that he's never not a threat in other movies, but he doesn't always feel threatening. Most of the time in Godzilla movies, the scale of damage and destruction gets lost amidst the spectacle of the action. Compared to other films, there's actually very little military hardware used against Godzilla, and it does that to the film's benefit. The scene where they're on the Minesweeper boat being chased is a great example of this. It's just 4 guys on a tiny boat trying to survive. It's like a scene from Jaws being chased and overwhelmed by the threat they face. It's entertaining, yet you feel the danger in the scene. And like Jaws, it knows how to hold back. There are a few major scenes with Godzilla, and none of them are meaningless. They all drastically move the plot forward, changing the course of the characters' lives. The way they portray the atomic breath is also unique and satisfying. There is an obvious build-up that is physically visible on Godzilla, which the movie uses as a ticking clock, with the metaphorical timer about to hit 0 before something happens in the final action sequence. It's a clever way to show how close Godzilla is to using his breath and add to the danger. Every time he uses it feels impactful. I can recall every time it was used because it was such a big deal each time. It also did a good job incorporating the nostalgia bits without going too far. Adding portions of the original score was wonderful, though when it first started, a part of me did go back to my lizard brain and wanted to see the big G just stomp around and smash things, disconnecting me from the horror of the destruction, like booting up a pre-built city in SimCity and just raining natural disasters upon it, which I'm sure everyone did, and I'm not a sociopath, why would you say that? Anywho, the music was a great callback to the Godzilla movies of old, and there was more nostalgia as well without being overwhelming. Godzilla chomping on a train doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but it's a nice callback to the original without being too on the nose about it. I'm certain a lot of people wouldn't necessarily make that connection, but it was fun to see. There are probably other things like that which I missed as well, given the long history they had to pull from. It was not distracting, and it did not bring the flow of the film to a halt to incorporate it. Conclusion. Godzilla Minus One made a lot of really good choices. The characters are not just window dressing or explanation givers to set up a Godzilla rampage or some other monster plot. The human scenes and the Godzilla scenes build off each other, raising the stakes and propelling it forward into a satisfying conclusion. My only criticism at the end was the tease for a sequel, which I get, but was also unnecessary. I wonder if a sequel to this exact plot would actually be worth doing, rather than just trying to build another good Godzilla movie, but that's a few seconds and doesn't really detract from the film either. I think this is one of the best Godzilla movies of all time. I'd hesitate to say it's the very best, but it is certainly a top contender, and I could see how someone would have this as their favorite. But what did you think of the movie? Do you think this one is the best? Let me know in the comments below. If you've made it to the end of the video, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and sharing it with others. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.